Hello, everyone. Welcome to Untold History, the channel where we unearth the most surprising and lesser-known events of our past. Today we travel to 17th century colonial Brazil to explore one of the most important resistances against slavery in the Americas, the rebellion of the Quilombos de Palmares. This is the story of a group of African slaves who escaped from Portuguese plantations to form a free society and who for decades resisted the attempts of the colonial authorities to destroy it. To understand this episode, we must first talk about colonial Brazil. During the 17th century, Brazil was one of Portugal's main colonies, and its economy depended heavily on slave labor. Thousands of Africans were forcibly brought from across the Atlantic to work on the sugarcane plantations, which had become the basis of the Brazilian economy. These Africans, separated from their families and subjected to harsh working conditions, did not always accept their fate. Many of them escaped from the plantations and took refuge in remote places, far from colonial control. These refugees formed autonomous communities known as Quilombos, and the most famous of all was the Quilombo de Palmares. Located in the mountains of the present-day Brazilian state of Alagoas, the Quilombo de Palmares was a confederation of communities that had formed sometime in the mid-16th century. Although initially a small community of runaway slaves, over the years, Palmares grew into an independent state that was home to thousands of people. Not only African slaves joined Palmares, but also indigenous people fleeing colonial exploitation and some poor Europeans seeking a better life away from the control of the Portuguese authorities. The Quilombo of Palmares extended over a vast area and was composed of a series of fortified villages. The most important of these villages was Cerca do Macaco, which became the capital of this free community. The inhabitants of Palmares lived from agriculture, growing corn, cassava, and other foods, and created a relatively stable social and political system. Despite their ethnic diversity, the inhabitants of Palmares shared a common goal: to defend their freedom against the Portuguese and other enemies who wanted to destroy their community. One of the most impressive aspects of Palmares was its ability to withstand repeated attempts by the Portuguese to destroy it for more than a century. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, slave lords and colonial authorities launched numerous military expeditions against Palmares, but their warriors defended themselves skillfully and bravely. The inhabitants of Palmares knew the mountainous terrain better than their enemies and used guerrilla tactics to inflict heavy losses on the colonial forces. Palmares' resistance became a legend in Brazil, and his story inspired many other slaves to run away and form their own quilombos. Palmares' most famous leader was Zumbi, who is remembered today as a hero of the African resistance in America. Zumbi was born in Palmares in 1655, and from a young age he was known for his skill as a warrior and leader. Throughout his life, Zumbi led the inhabitants of Palmares in the defense of their community against colonial attacks. Under his leadership, the Quilombo continued to resist the Portuguese, despite the numerous military campaigns launched against them. The figure of Zumbi has become a symbol of resistance and freedom not only in Brazil, but throughout Latin America. The war between Palmares and the colonial authorities reached its climax at the end of the 17th century. In 1678, the Portuguese managed to capture one of Palmares' leaders, Gonga Zumba, who was Zumbi's uncle. Gonga Zumba agreed to sign a peace treaty with the Portuguese, offering freedom to the inhabitants of Palmares in exchange for abandoning their armed resistance and accepting colonial control. However, Zumbi rejected the treaty, believing that the only way to guarantee the freedom of his people was to continue fighting. This decision led him to become the main leader of the Quilombo. Finally, in 1694, the colonial authorities decided to put an end to Palmares once and for all. They organized a large military expedition led by the famous bandeirante Domingos Jorge Velho, an experienced slave hunter who had been hired by the Portuguese to destroy the Quilombo. The final battle was brutal. Palmares' warriors fought bravely, but were outmatched by the colonial forces, who were better armed and organized. Cerca do Macaco, the capital of Palmares, was captured and destroyed. Many of the inhabitants of the Quilombo were killed or captured and then enslaved. Zumbi managed to escape the battle, but was betrayed by one of his own men and captured the following year, in 1695. He was brutally executed by the Portuguese, who cut off his head and publicly displayed it in the city of Recife as a warning to other slaves who might try to rebel. However, although Palmares was destroyed and Zumbi killed, his legacy of resistance endured. The history of the Quilombo of Palmares and Zumbi has left a deep mark on the history of Brazil and on the fight against slavery in America. Palmares became a symbol of freedom, and Zumbi is remembered as a national hero in Brazil. Every November 20th, Black Awareness Day is celebrated in Brazil in honor of Zumbi and the resistance of Palmares. This day is a reminder of the struggle of people of African descent for freedom and justice in a society that for centuries was marked by slavery and racial discrimination. The Quilombo of Palmares was much more than a community of fugitive slaves. It was an independent nation that challenged the colonial system and oppression. Palmares' story shows that even in the most adverse circumstances, people can find ways to resist and fight for their freedom. Palmares also inspired the creation of other quilombos in Brazil and throughout Latin America, where escaped slaves sought refuge and resisted the slave system. The importance of Palmares goes beyond Brazilian history. It is an example of how oppressed communities can organize, resist, and fight for their rights. The legacy of Palmares and Zumbi has been vindicated by Afro-descendant movements throughout the continent, which see in their history a source of inspiration for the fight against racism and inequality in the present. In short, the rebellion of the Quilombos of Palmares is one of the most important chapters of the African resistance in America. Palmares' ability to resist colonial attempts to destroy it for more than a century is a testament to the determination and courage of its inhabitants. Although Palmares was eventually destroyed, his legacy lives on in the history and consciousness of Brazil and all of Latin America. Thank you for joining us in this analysis of the rebellion of the Quilombos of Palmares. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell for more revealing stories in Untold Story. See you in the next one.